Hey everyone, in today's video I'll be taking a look at the games which basically exposed that DrLupo was violating the chess.com fair play policy. Okay, so taking a look at the first game where DrLupo has the white pieces, he starts out with the Ponziani opening, and this is especially tricky at the intermediate and beginner level where white usually tries to gambit a pawn early on to gain central control and initiative. And here Wolfey, playing as black, responds with bishop d6. It's not the best move but also not the worst move per se, because black is developing the dark squared bishop and is getting ready to castle, and he also basically protects his e5 pawn, keeps everything solid. The only drawback is that he does hinder his development, especially with the light squared bishop. Now going forward, white develops naturally, black trades in the center once and gives a check, and white simply blocks with the knight, developing it. And here black plays d6, continuing to develop his light squared bishop, and white here plays knight d5. And so far nothing too suspicious in the game, and knight d5 is a nice move, centralizing the knight. And here black takes and white takes back, and the idea here is pretty simple. With knight d5, once the trade happens, you get the open file for your rook and potentially target the king, which has not been castled yet. Obviously not immediately, because the dark squared bishop is here for black still, but if you kick it out in the future with a3 perhaps, and once the bishop moves, then you can develop your rook to the open file. And not to mention, this pawn immediately is attacking the c6 knight, and the knight has to move to a less active square. In the game, Wolfey takes on d4, and white here has a winning tactic which was not played, and the move was queen a4 check, hitting the bishop and hitting the king. Basically you'll be winning back a piece, and white should be winning here. However, in the game, white did not play that. Instead, white took on d4 and actually hung his queen. And in this position, white throws in the intermediate move, check, and after the black king moves, then he takes back. And this is where perhaps things start to get a bit iffy, as we've mentioned that DrLupo was caught violating the fair play policy. And as the game goes on, this is where things get spicy. So first of all, b4 basically sacrificing another pawn, but basically the idea of developing his pieces, developing his bishop to b2, and basically eyeing this diagonal which is wide open. And once black plays a6, trying to kick the light squared bishop out, and once the light squared bishop does end up retreating, he plays queen e7, and he tries to basically bring in his major pieces. And this is where white plays rook e3 and basically starts gaining back control of the e file that he opened up earlier on. And as you see so far, after white has lost his queen, all the moves start coming in pretty nicely. Nothing too bad so far, but especially the counter, not counter, but the intermediate move of playing check before capturing the queen, and then playing b4 and then developing his bishops to the active diagonals. This has been nice play by white so far. Nothing too unnatural, and so far so good. And here white continues to basically shuffle his rook, attacking the black queen, kind of annoying, but also aligning his pieces in a way in which sort of could cause trouble in the future for the black king. And here that does leave a pawn hanging. However, that opens up more diagonals for white to attack, and as you see here, now the f7 pawn is under sight. The g7 pawn is basically now also under the sight once this knight moves. This rook can always shuffle around and target these two pawns, and the black king doesn't seem so safe. And here black plays queen e4, and white goes back with knight c2. And this basically is a nice move, basically opening up the bishop, opening up the dark squared bishop, as I mentioned earlier, and also looking to bring his rook to the central files. Obviously not now, as I mentioned before, the dark squared bishop is still here, but perhaps in the future. And here black plays f6, again stopping the dark squared bishop from eyeing the g7 pawn. And here white continues to harass the black queen, and so far all the moves from white have been pretty sort of spot on, I would say, but again nothing too unnatural, because so far it's all about developing his pieces and keeping them active. But one thing I would mention is, if you watch the replay of DrLupo playing, you do see him often looking at the side where he sees another monitor, which is interesting. But anyway, going back to the game here, after rook to e3, another idea with the knight going back to c2 was, it was looking at the bishop on b4, and now the queen has been tied down to the bishop, and the queen had to play a move like he had to play a move like queen g4, keeping an eye on his bishop so he doesn't lose it. But in this case, he goes back with the queen and he loses his dark squared bishop, and now this rook on a1 can also get active among the e file. Here black brings his rook in, and white continues to keep more pieces on the board because he is playing against the queen, and it's better for him to keep his pieces on the board, keep him more active for chances to outplay his opponent. And here again he goes back to g3, still harassing the black queen, and again trying to target black's soft pawn chain. Once the queen goes back here, black plays bishop c3, defending against mate threats and also protecting the knight. And after a5, playing knight e5, centralizing the knight to a really nice active square. And this is where things start getting spicy, I would say, much more, because here white after a4 ignores the threat but rather takes on c7, counter-attacking black's rook. And once black plays rook c8, here white plays bishop d5, once again another impressive intermediate move, counter-attacking the queen while the knight is protecting the light squared bishop, even though it is being attacked. And once the black queen moves, here the knight moves again, giving another check. And amongst this chaos, one thing you have to realize is that black's queen is hanging, and once the king moves in this position, he still gives another check, not taking the hanging queen. And once the king moves, that's when, if you watch the live recording, he mentions, oh wait, the black queen is hanging, and then he takes it, as if everything that's happened so far was a bit accidental, even though they were all like high level engine moves. And also, so far this has been a really nice game. If you watch my other videos, I mentioned about how in chess you should have this mentality of making threat after threat and basically developing your pieces to most active squares. And this is what most even like 2000 plus rated players struggle with, keeping basically developing their pieces to much more active squares and keeping the play going on with basically threats back and forth. And that's what DrLupo managed to do in this position, and basically flawless play after he has hung his queen. And after the pawn takes here, he goes back with the bishop and reroutes it to give a check. The rook is cutting off the king, and once rook f7 happens, again another interesting moment here. Obviously you can't say just from the moves itself, but usually here lower rated players, as long as I know, would just take with the bishop immediately. Natural instinct, as you just move the bishop around and then take. But here rook takes f7, you have to say, is a pretty again perfect move, because you keep the king boxed inside and then you move the rook with tempo and you're checkmating, and in this position white is completely winning. So a couple of things you can take away from this game is basically you should always look to keep your pieces active, as you saw earlier on in the game. B4 was in this earlier on move 14, b4 was played to basically rook lift and bring over the rook to attack the black king, which was forced to move and not castle. Playing moves like bishop b2, rerouting the bishop back to target these weak things, kingside pawns. And this rook on h8 now really got too active and black was a bit suffocating. So this was, I would say, pretty high level play after especially hanging your queen in the opening. Now I would also like to take a quick look at the second game, but nothing too much in detail. So going into the opening, DrLupo was playing as black, and as you see so far as I quickly go through the moves, black here doesn't play the most accurate opening. Definitely a lot of inaccuracies, especially if it moves like f6 in the opening and then dancing around with the knight to b4 and then back to a6. Definitely misplaced. And as you see, white here has developed most of his pieces already while black really hasn't yet. And in this position, it looks like white is much better, especially with his development, piece placement. But black does manage to sort stuff out. He plays the move pawn f5, which is pretty strong, basically targeting white's pawn chain in the center. And then once he defends, basically bringing both of his knights to active squares in the closed position, and all of a sudden they're teaming up, basically hitting key squares. And after the queen comes in and this trade, now he does manage to basically trade off a couple of pieces and get all of his pieces active. And as you see right now, it doesn't look as bad as it did a few moves ago. And again, e3, managing to find this move to basically undouble his pawns and further open up the position in his favor, using his knight on g4. And here now he again plays rook b4, and next move he brings his rook over to g4, basically sliding it over to now attack the queen. Attack the king. And this is again pretty good stuff here, targeting white's king and basically activating his pieces like usually lower players wouldn't. And again, now after knight e6, bringing in his king all of a sudden after this rook slide, not taking the pawn, not having any tunnel vision, but bringing in the king and then trapping the knight basically. And white decides to give away his knight in this way, and after takes, now he throws in the intermediate check and then goes back to stop the pawn. So as you see, there's a lot of intermediate moves in DrLupo's play, and usually this is harder for lower levels, lower elo rated players to play, especially with low time on the clock. In this position he had like 1 minute per se, and now pushing his pawns, bringing his king in, and basically it's managing to stop white's only hope with his king. And in this position he creates a passed pawn for himself. And here now, instead of pushing the pawns or trying to win more material and try to with this pawn trying to trade it off or whatever, he brings in his king and finishes off in style and perfection, where he basically checkmates like this instead of trying to push his pawn and queen and win in a much more effortless way, I would say, like with much more pre-moves under time pressure. But instead he plays accurately and he manages to checkmate white. So as you see here, it basically looks like a mix between either really low level play or really high level play. I feel like that's one giveaway that he has violated fair play policy. And another couple of stuff as well, he often looks to the side, as I've mentioned before. And in the end, chess.com has decided he has violated fair play policy. And what do you think? Well, whatever you do think, one thing I would say is, first of all, game wise to take away is, as you see, always try to play the most active moves and develop your pieces, and good things will happen, as you saw in this game where black manages to basically rook lift and slide through and put pressure. And again earlier with his development, with it bringing in his knights and making crucial pawn breaks. So these are the types of moves you should be looking for, trying to create counterplay. And cheating wise, I would say hopefully we all learn from this and grow as a community. Hopefully this doesn't happen too often in the future again, and hopefully if PogChamps ever happens again, we won't see any more fair play policy violations. So that's it for today, and see you next video. Bye.